So let's see. You see the first slide?
Yes, sir.
Second slide. Okay. Yeah, the purpose of this is, normally this is our location slide. The implication here, however, is what I would like to do is to begin to show you the location of the federal navigation project that extends from the ocean all the way up to Wilmington, city of Wilmington. What's represented here is the former channel alignment that existed prior to 2000, and then the new channel alignment, which was associated also with a deepening project and a widening project in or about year 2000. And I'm going to get into the details of that in a second. So the actual beach management activities were really initiated in the 1990s. There were two small-scale beach fill projects where sand was placed out of the navigation project on the point and in West Beach. That was done by the federal government. However, you paid for it. It was not. There was no subsidization by the Fed, and so it was done under what's called Section 206. Also in the 90s, the village initiated the sand tube groin field, which is 16 sand-filled soft structures, which is very unique for the state of North Carolina and actually required specific legislation to be done. That particular project was actually well described in a small article in the Shore and Beach magazine back in 1998, which probably there should be a copy around. That project was actually conceptually designed by us as a part of this feasibility study on beach restoration from April of '89. This study was prepared by Dr. Kevin Bodge of our office, and it was the first time that the specifics of erosion and also the specifics of the navigation project had ever been evaluated in the context of damage to Bald Head Island. Now, a couple of key things that came out of this study is first that it actually conceptually recommended the groin field, which was not implemented by us. The village at the time hired a local engineering firm to implement it. It also analytically, through some, it was state-of-the-art modeling back then, which is pretty crude today. It determined that on South Beach, there's a nodal point, which is interesting because that's the point where the net transport goes in two different directions. So that nodal point is about a third of the way down the beach from the point towards the east. And what it says is that from that point eastward, the net transport during the year is towards Cape Fear. And from that point westward, the net transport is towards the inlet. Now, it doesn't mean that sand doesn't move in both directions during the year, but what it means is that in the net, the sand that is lost divides at that point and goes to the two extreme ends of the island. That was literally unknown, and that was a result of some of the numerical modeling that was done. We also developed a causal link between the federal navigation project and erosion of Bald Head Island, which of course had long been alleged by the developer and by the village itself over time, but obviously had been denied by the Wilmington District Corps of Engineers for many, many decades. It also laid out potential cost-sharing options and the definition of what beach restoration activities in the future would look like, because none of that existed at that time on the island. The other an important thing that was initiated in about 2000 was a very detailed monitoring program that measures the beach twice a year, both the East Beach, South Beach, and West Beach, with the intent of determining over time the performance of sand that's placed on the island, but also to assist in the development of the long-term causal links between the navigation project and beach erosion on the island. And this is probably the most important thing that the village did, or one of the most important things that the village did back in 2000, because we've relied on the results of this monitoring program for many years in many of the requests that have been made to the federal government. Now, what you need to understand is that when you stabilize a tidal inlet, either with structures, and you don't have to have structures, or you construct a navigation channel and you keep that channel at one location, by virtue of dredging it to maintain its authorized navigable depth, you modify the morphology of the inlet's environment, and there's always a price to pay. And it doesn't matter if you're talking about the Cape Fear River, the Savannah River, Jacksonville Harbor, Charleston, the results are always the same. And so this particular slide, which we presented, I think, back in the 90s to the federal government, it looks at the change in the sand sharing system that was here naturally, which is the slide on the left in the 1800s. That's prior to the navigation project. You can compare that to the slide on the right, which just looks at conditions during a massive survey that was done in about 2005, 2006. In the right-hand slide, obviously, you see the navigation channel as it exists today. You can also see remnants of where it was. The arrows you're looking at here are net flow arrows or vectors computed by numerical modeling. But the important thing to realize or to see in the inner comparison is the loss of sand over time, which is reflected by the light yellow and orange colors. And so in the slide on the left, you see what's called a sand sharing system that naturally existed across the island, across the inlet, from Bald Head Island to Oak Island. And you can see on the right that that system not only is bifurcated by the channel, but it's been affected. You can see, you don't have to be a coastal engineer to see, qualitatively see the differences in the amount of sand that's in that system. Now, as coastal engineers, what we can do is we can take historical bathymetric charts and we map difference in them, and we can begin to quantify what these volumes of change are. And simplistically, what you see here is that there's sort of a loser and a winner in the post-navigation project environment. Oak Island gained a lot of sand over time. Bald Head Island lost a lot of sand, particularly within Bald Head Shoal. Another important element of this is the loss of sand out of the sand sharing system vis-a-vis dredging. And so that's reflected by the red 24.2 million cubic yards, which were taken out of the sand sharing system only between 1976 and 95. That sand was taken to an offshore location, which is called the ODMDS, which is an offshore disposal area, because that was the cheapest way to affect the maintenance of the project. That is to say, they didn't put the sand back on the beaches like they do today. Before 2000, the Corps took all this sand and just dumped it offshore with hopper dredges. And the implication of that is that every year they did that, they would take some volume of sand out of the sand sharing system to the point that the system looked something like this. Another thing that the Corps did back when they were developing the navigation project is that they closed off new inlet. They did that so that all the water that goes up, all tidal influence would be through the mouth of the Cape Fear River that existed between Smith Island and Oak Island. So instead of water coming in both New Inlet and at this location, they closed this off so that all flow would enter and exit between the two barrier islands. And again, this particular slide again shows you the new channel alignment, shows you the old alignment, and it shows you where the ODMDS is located. It's relatively deep water, 30 to 40 feet, which means that once that sand is placed in that area, it will no longer move under natural forces. So that sand was lost out of the system through the maintenance and operational procedures of the Wilmington District Corps of Engineers up until 2000. Now in 2000, the Corps adopted a new standard. Basically, to some degree, we call it regional sediment management. They were dragged into that on the basis of information that was provided to them through one or more white papers that we developed on behalf of the Village of Bald Head Island, submitted to the federal government, that recognized and codified the long-term impacts of that navigation project, as well as the potential impacts of the harbor and deepening project and the continued removal of sand from the system. So in or about 2000, the Corps of Engineers, vis-a-vis the Wilmington District, developed a new philosophy, which we appreciate. This particular slide sums up part of that. It basically says if you take a cubic yard of littoral system out of a tidal entrance or an inlet, and you take it out of the littoral zone, it's going to cause a cubic yard of erosion somewhere within the system, particularly on in our case, one of the two barrier islands. And again, you didn't have to be a coastal engineer to recognize the physical impact of the new channel alignment, which is under construction here. This is Becky, who was a village manager at the time. Literally, you could hit the dredge probably with a silver dollar if you had a decent arm. But this particular dredge is constructing the new alignment and the new width in 2000 associated with the federally authorized deepening project. Again, part of the information that we shared with the Corps on behalf of the village tried to quantify the physical impacts of the navigation project on the island. And so in this particular case, the federal project is defined, the bottom of the federal project is defined as the area between the two red lines. That's the alignment of the project. And what you see here is shoaling of sand off of the point. Well, the Corps calls this shoaling. We call it the toe of the island. And so you can see that between dredging events, there's always a conflict here, whereby sand comes off of Bald Head Island and fills in the navigation project because that's what nature wants to do. The Corps episodically comes and dredges that material out, historically took it out of the system, but now vis-a-vis the Wilmington Harbor Sand Management Plan, which the village played an intimate role in getting the district to incorporate into their project, that sand now goes back either to Oak Island or it goes back to Bald Head Island. And again, when we talk about the conflict between the two, we're not talking about just the bottom width. We also have the side slopes to account for. So in this particular case, if you look at the side slopes of that navigation project, they physically intercept almost the mean high water line at the point. And again, the Corps is required to come dredge this channel every 2 to 3 years in order to keep it navigable. And so there is a continuing impact, there's a continuing movement of littoral sand. So over time, the village developed a shore stabilization strategy that's best viewed as a three-legged stool. So in this particular case, as I mentioned, we now, both Oak Island and the village of Bald Head Island, receive sand from the Wilmington Harbor Sand Management Plan. That is to say, the plan that was adopted proposed to put 2/3 of the sand on Bald Head Island and about 1/3 more or less on Oak Island. And the way they did this is that Bald Head would get 2 disposal events to 1 disposal event on Oak Island. And that had ramifications because there would be a period of time when Bald Head Island would not get sand. And because of that, the Bald Head Island was required to develop and to construct their own renourishment projects when sand was going to Oak Island. The third leg of the stool is a function of the structures that are required to improve the performance of sand that is placed on Bald Head Island, and in particular on South Beach episodically. So this is an example of the federal disposal project that was constructed a year ago, literally a year ago. And you can see here that through the cooperation of the district, they now are placing the sand in the guise of pretty much a fill berm that would be akin to performing beach restoration. They do this, again, episodically. The limits of fill are determined by the volume of sand that comes out of the channel at any one point in time. Normally, it's about 1 million cubic yards, about 1 to 1.1 million cubic yards when they dredge. Last year when they dredged, however, it was almost 1.5 million cubic yards. And the Corps was able to almost reach down to Cape Fear and to the Shoals Club, and I'll get into that in a second. But again, this is what it looks like in the fill process that's ongoing here as you're looking east. This is what it looks like when you're looking west. You can see the discharge coming out of the 30-inch steel pipe. You can see the dredge in the background, dredging the channel back to its original authorized dimensions. Well, as I mentioned, in the off years, in order to not have dramatic setbacks in the configuration of the beach on South Beach and the dunes, the village was required to perform beach restoration funded solely by the village. The first major project that was constructed utilized sand that came out of a borrow site located on the very distal end of Jaybird Shoals. And that area looks something like this. And again, you can see here the old channel alignment, and you can see the new channel alignment. Notice again that this channel alignment, unfortunately, was directed through Bald Head Shoal, and there are implications associated with that. We're currently in the process of trying to develop a second major borrow site located somewhere in this box, actually in closer proximity to the island. And I'll talk about that at the end of my presentation. This is Frying Pan Shoals, which extends, it's a sand formation, which extends offshore some 30 miles. And there are literally several billion cubic yards of sand located in that feature. Now, this particular slide is of keen interest to us, but also should be of keen interest to you, because it represents the amount of sand placed principally on South Beach, and that's really where we'll place our emphasis, over time, the regression of that volume of sand over time through natural processes, the reintroduction of that sand either through disposal events, as shown here. Again, this is a disposal event by the Corps, another disposal event. And so you would see incremental increases in the volume of sand. And these were the ones that were on the tune of order of magnitude of about 1 million cubic yards. That sand, again, under natural processes and also man-influenced processes having to do with the navigation project, the sand would leave South Beach over time. So in 2009, the Wilmington Harbor Sand Management Plan said, okay, Bald Head Island, you got the first 2 disposals. Now in 2009, the disposal goes to Oak Island. As a result of that, the village constructed a major beach restoration project here at their own expense. And again, you can see as the sand is diminishing volumetrically from South Beach, there's an influx of sand here of about 1.5 million cubic yards. And again, over time, the sand diminishes. At the same time, we also rebuilt the sand tube groin fields in an improved version. We moved some of the groins. We used better product than was originally used. And the purpose of that was to reduce the sand losses or to minimize the sand losses over time, particularly in the immediate vicinity of the navigation project, where the inlet impacts are the greatest. So over time, you see this particular curve representing the volume of sand that exists in South Beach, okay, from one end to the other. At this point in time, after the 2021 federal project, we now have 3.4 million cubic yards of sand in the South Beach littoral system that did not exist there at the beginning of our period, which is with the inception of the federal project. So the inclination of this particular graph, as I'll get into in just a second, because it slopes upward, it intimates very, very emphatically the success of your beach restoration project. That is to say that over time, there is 3 million, at least at this point in time, there is 3 million cubic yards of sand in your beach system, your dune system, that did not exist in 2000. So as I intimated, then that trend line is indicative of a successful beach restoration project. In this particular case, your beach restoration project is a function of sand placed by the government and also by you. And again, we can see when we read the data there that structures are required to reduce the sand losses and to maximize the performance over time of this beach fill project. And just as an example to show you the nature of the improvement of the beach and the beach profile, this is a section of the beach out of our monitoring program at one particular station, which we just picked here. So the beach profile in 2000 is represented by the black line. The beach profile in 2018 is represented by the purple line. You can see here that there actually is a dune in 2018 that did not exist in 2000. Dune is what goes up to elevation 16, 17. And you can see that there's a significant difference between these two lines. It intimates the height of the sand literally that was placed or was in place in 2018 relative to the profile, to the beach profile in 2000. So if you go to basically, let's say to the intertidal beach between mean high water and mean low water, and you stand there today, in year 2000, there was 14 feet of less sand vertically there than there was in 2018. So what we've done is we've pushed the profile out over time. We've maintained a beach width and a beach berm that didn't exist in 2000. And throughout much of the island today, we have a pretty robust dune system. All of that is a function of that 3 million cubic yards, at least that exists there today. But even over time, it's been an ever increasing volume. So the third leg of the stool is the use of structures to reduce sand losses, particularly when we get in the proximity of the navigation project and the river itself. And as we indicated, over time, we've had a sand tube groin field that's been there since the mid-90s. We've replaced that groin field at least twice because these sand tubes, they basically wear out. So that is to say that the gradual erosion and abrasion of these tubes due to the natural forces of the waves and the sand movement literally wear the fabric out because they are only constructed of fabric. Again, another view looking backwards. But what I can tell you is that if these tubes were not there, this particular shoreline would be back to the road. It would be under these buildings. And we know that because there have been periods of time, particularly before we rebuilt this groin field, when that exactly was the occasion. Matter of fact, we did have storms that impacted the road. Of course, at this point in time, we now only have a beach that we're maintaining out here, but we have a fairly robust dune system. Now, these particular sand tubes are unique in that the only way that we can construct them is in the dry. And so every time we have rebuilt them, we've rebuilt them concurrent with a beach restoration or a beach disposal project whereby we could go in, we could excavate the beach, we could take out the old groin, we could put in the new groin, and then we could backfill it. So that is to say that we really couldn't build these groins out into the sea successfully. So we build them in the land, and then we allow the beach to equilibrate or erode around it. Now, even though the sand tubes were successful in protecting those properties, and you can see transparently here, you can see the location of those tubes. There was always a point in time where either the fill placed by the federal government or the fill placed by the village, particularly in areas like this, would last only about 1 to 2 years before the shoreline receded back to the sand tube structures. So what this argued for was the construction of a terminal groin, as indicated here, at the end of the island to better stabilize this particular area and to allow for the implementation of something that would function as a template for the sand that was placed there. And again, would better reduce sand losses to the inlet. So in about, I think it was 2013 or 2014, the state of North Carolina passed a law, modified legislation that said that, okay, there could be a couple terminal groins in the state of North Carolina. The first one built was built by the village of Bald Head Island. The second one is under construction today, some 7 or 8 years later. So for a long period of time, this was the only terminal groin that was successfully constructed. Now, terminal groin, again, as I tried to indicate, it's basically a perpendicular structure placed at the end of a littoral system. The end of our littoral system, of course, is the end of our barrier island. In this particular case, that section of the island immediately adjacent to the Cape Fear River and the navigation project. And again, the goal here is to beneficially affect littoral transport. At the same time, of course, We want to reduce the navigation project impacts, which are implied as greater sand losses from the beach that would occur under normal processes. And again, to provide some template for a realignment of the shoreline at that location, so that again, we can reduce the rates of littoral transport. Littoral transport being the amount of sand that's moved on, let's say, annually down the shoreline. So in leading up to the navigation or to the implementation of this, several years of modeling were performed, in addition to a year or two of actual permitting on the basis of that modeling. And what we found for purposes of justifying terminal groin at this location was that we could indeed reduce the littoral transport rate in theory from about 440,000 cubic yards per year down to about 164,000 cubic yards per year. This type of modeling and these results resulted in the lack of opposition by the Audubon Society and other environmental resource agencies who were adamantly against terminal groins at the time. They realized that the condition that the village of the Bald Head Island had was different than other barrier islands, and that we could well substantiate it and had substantiated the impact of the navigation project on Bald Head Island. And we could also prove through numerical modeling that by the construction of a terminal groin, which did not impact anybody, which, however, we had to prove again through the use of the numerical model, that particular structure could be endorsed or certainly not opposed by the resource agencies. And so for a long period of time, this was the only terminal groin project that was permitted in the state. So again, to better envision the benefits proposed here and actually realized, this is the shoreline alignment here that would occur after sand placement. And it didn't matter how much sand we placed out into seaward of the point or on South Beach, either ourselves or the Corps of Engineers. The shoreline would always recede back to the sand tube groin field, which is under this red line. So this was the chronic erosion problem we were trying to address. But through the introduction of the terminal groin, as shown in this particular case, we now have a template for beach fill placed here, which allows for a very large fillet of sand, which is on the order of magnitude of about 250,000 cubic yards. And we have now pushed the shoreline away from this chronic area of erosion, and we're keeping the shoreline out in this location. Now, I will tell you that the modeling here and the original permits for the project looked at the permitting of a terminal groin, which was 1,900 feet long. We did not, however, construct a 1,900-foot long structure. We constructed a terminal groin to a terminal length of 1,300 feet. We have the ability through the permit to extend that if we need to in the future. But even though the modeling showed that there'd be significant benefit to South Beach through a 1,900-foot long groin, we felt that there would be adverse impacts to West Beach. That is to say that the terminal groin at 1,900 feet would be too successful. It would actually reduce the amount of sand that gets to West Beach. And by doing so, we would create we would solve one erosion problem at the sake of another. So we'd shoot ourselves in the foot. So what was constructed originally was a 1,300-foot long structure, which is what you see located here. And again, in November of last year, this is the condition after the last federal beach fill project. And again, the terminal groin is highly successful. And as you see here, sand does go across this groin by design. It goes around it and it goes across it. And just again, for your own edification, the way that we built this structure, again, is we built it in the dry, predominantly anyhow. The end of the structure was here. We were able to build probably about 1,100 feet of this structure, literally in the beach disposal project that had been constructed months before we initiated this contract. This allowed for a very cost-effective terminal groin construction. Matter of fact, it was on the order of magnitude of 4.5 million cubic yards. If we had elected to do this in the wet, when the island had eroded back to the terminal growing field, it would have been a multiple of that. And I'm not sure that even it would have been as feasible to construct it as it was in the dry. And again, this shows you again that we built it, we then backfilled it to the point that it's transparent, except at the distal end out here where it's exposed by storm waves every once in a while. And again, this is what we call a permeable groin, in that it is designed to allow sand to go over it during storm events and through it, right, in order to not starve the downdrift shoreline. And just another view, last month, of the end of the groin. And again, you can see that there's a substantial spit here, which continues to feed sand to West Beach. Well, I'm going to leave South Beach for a few minutes and talk about another important sand manipulation process or program that was been implemented over time by the village. And it has to do with sand bypassing at the entrance to the Marina Channel. And it's pretty obvious that this is a necessary program because we have sand that moves down West Beach naturally. The net transport of sand on West Beach is from south to north. So sand does enter into the navigation project, and it has since the implementation of the marina, at its earliest implementation. And up until a few years ago, before the village took over responsibility for the entrance channel, the developer literally kept a small dredge in the marina. That small dredge would go out every month and dredge the entrance to the channel. Now in 2015, it was decided that the village should take over the maintenance, and several things happened at that time. One, we extended the original structures that had been constructed by the developer early in the 70s or 80s. We extended those structures out, we hooked them, we added rock so that it would be better. We would have less shoaling basically of the channel itself over time. But we kept the basic program, and the basic program was that a dredge would be brought in episodically, not on a monthly basis, but perhaps once or twice a year, depending on need. The channel would be dredged out, and the dredge at that time would also dig a small crater on the updrift side or the downdrift side of the Marina Channel in order for sand that was transported up West Beach to infill that crater before it went into the navigation project. Now, all of the sand that is taken out of here has been moved to the other side, or to the north side of the entrance, as a bypass program in order to feed the beach that existed up here seaward of Rowboat Row. Now, we did find over time that even with the extension of the jetties that you see here, we still had exacerbated sand losses in this vicinity. Part of that was natural through waves that would affect this area from the southeast. The other part was man-induced, and that was basically the ferry system. As you ride the ferry in each day, or particularly coming in, you'll notice that the ferry has to come in at a pretty high rate of speed. And the reason is that there's cross currents out here. So in order to maintain stability and the direction of the ferry, he's got to come in at a high rate of speed. And then he immediately, as soon as he gets within the confines of the entrance to the Marina Channel, he slows down. Well, as he comes in at a high rate of speed, he always introduces some small wave field caused by the water that is pushed by the ferry. And what we found, what we identified, is that part of the erosion that we had in this location was ferry induced. So we constructed two T-head structures, or actually two breakwaters. We wanted them to be T-head structures, but the state wouldn't allow us to do it, which were placed in this area to stabilize and to keep part of the sand that is bypassed here in a condition whereby we would have a protected beach. So what occurs over time is that the village now bypasses sand, it tries to bypass that sand as far north as it can. And again, we're restricted by the permits associated with this process, unfortunately, so that it again supplements any erosion that we have outside the limits of the structures. I'll also note here that there originally was a third structure that was proposed, but it was disallowed by the regulatory agencies in the process of negotiating even to build these two, unfortunately. Switching back to South Beach and to the east end of South Beach, obviously it's well acknowledged that we have issues with the condition of Cape Fear. And that is to say, Cape Fear itself is a depositional area that feeds Frying Pan Shoals. It is fed by sand that comes from the north and sand that comes from the west along South Beach. And it's pretty well documented that Cape Fear is the tail that wags the dog. And that is to say that what happens with respect to Cape Fear and the configuration of Cape Fear at one point in time affects the stability of these two shorelines. And unfortunately, in this particular case, it affects the immediate stability of the beach in front of the Shoals Club. So this is what things looked like back in 2008. There was a relatively decent dune and beach system seaward of Cape Fear. But unfortunately, during some period of storm events, there was a breakthrough in the attachment of the Frying Pan Shoals to Cape Fear itself. Water was allowed to go through this nearshore channel, which very effectively stripped sand away from the beaches in the vicinity of the Shoals Club. So this is what it looked like in 2014, and most recently, let's say in 2021. And this shot was several months after the federal beach disposal program, which reflected in the placement of sand, which almost reached the Shoals Club, as represented here. Unfortunately, the amount of sand that the Corps had to dispose of, which was about 1.5 million cubic yards, ended up right here. Didn't reach the Shoals Club. You can see here, however, the contractor's equipment is attempting to push some sand up seaward of the Shoals Club in the form of a little bit of a berm and a little bit of a dune, pretty much to no avail. Unfortunately, we had reflected to the Corps that they needed to modify the width of their project sometime back, about a third of the project back, in order to reach the Shoals Club. They did not abide by any recommendations we made to them. And unfortunately, this is literally where the sand ran out. So the Corps was well intended, but unfortunately, the Shoals Club did not get the benefit of beach disposal, which was a quite unique beach disposal because it was 1.5 million cubic yards in lieu of the normal 1 million cubic yards that the Corps dredges. Well, what are the solutions for the Shoals Club? Well, again, perhaps the Wilmington Harbor Sand Management Plan and some disposal project, if we could convince the Corps to place sand at that location, which would probably require a contribution on the part of the village, because placing sand that far down in conflict the way they normally do it would cost additional money, because it would be more expensive for the contractor to do it. Another potential solution, which is down the road, has to do with the harbor deepening project. And we say that because with each of these harbor deepening projects, there is a significant amount of sand that comes out of the channel, both from the deepening and the widening. And of course, that back in 2000, with the first deepening widening of the channel, Bald Head Island got about 1.5 million cubic yards. As a matter of fact, that sand did go all the way down to Cape Fear. So there is some potential there, depending on the timing of that project and perhaps negotiations between the village and the Corps in getting strategic sand placed all the way down to the Shoals Club. The other option, of course, is the village to build their own project, which is one of the reasons we're looking at Frying Pan Shoals as a borrow site. That particular site is conducive to us placing sand, large quantity of sand in this particular case, seaward of the Shoals Club in order to change the dynamic down there, particularly in the near shore zone, where we cannot get the frying pan shoals to attach to the shoreline like it did historically. Theoretically, if I was in another state, I could probably also beneficially affect the Shoals Club problems through the use of structures, but that's not the case in the state of North Carolina. So this is the theoretical sand source utilization plan that we've been going by from about 2015 up to the present. And what you see here is that in 2021, you got disposal pursuant to the Wilmington Harbor and Sand Management Plan. In 2021, the disposal went to Bald Head Island. You will again get the sand in 2024, but then as you see here in 2027, we are theoretically planning for a local project to be built by the village, and ideally using frying pan shoals, because at that point in time, the disposal project goes to Oak Island. Well, again, frying pan shoals from a coastal engineering perspective is one of the most cost-effective borrow sites that we could utilize to put sand on the beach. And it's an expensive process, obviously, to do this. It is also, from a physical viewpoint, it's the most suitable sand. It's the most coarse sand. And the coarser the sand, the better the performance of any beach fill you construct. Now, unfortunately, we're in the permit process, and there is an environmental issue. It has to do with fisheries objections. We don't believe those objections are viable, but there's probably a price to pay to prove that point. And you will soon be considering a monitoring plan, fisheries monitoring plan, proposed by LMG, who is participating in the permitting process, to do certain fisheries monitoring on the shoal formation out there to try to break our permit loose. Because our permit is in the process right now where there are objections, and we need to prove and to codify the points that we have made that there really will not be any fisheries impacts associated with that borrow site. Now, other theoretical considerations by the Village Council, and these have been tossed around for a long time. One consideration that's been proposed is to convert the sand tube groins to rock structures. The reason being is we've been replacing the sand tube groins basically on a 5-year interval. And so there's a cost of doing that. Nominally, the last cost was about 1 million cubic yards. So one rhetorical question is, well, why don't we make those permanent structures so we don't have to episodically replace them? Well, that's very difficult in the state of North Carolina. And at this point in time, it's probably not feasible permit-wise. It would take, again, probably some modifications or legislation having to do with those structures. The other rhetorical question is, well, why don't we build a terminal structure at Cape Fear to solve the Shoals Club problem there, and due to the breaking away of frying pan shoals from the shoreline. So again, these are questions on the table. They probably will be legislatively and regulatory discussed, at least in the near future, but the actual feasibility of permitting either one of these is quite questionable. So with that, that concludes my presentation. I'd be glad to answer any questions. And in the best of all worlds, Cape Fear would revert to something like this that existed back in the 50s and 60s.
Questions? Eric, thanks so much. That was very informative.
I appreciate it.
Thank you, Eric. Go ahead.